This is video history from the J. Bay Jacobs Library for the History of Obstetrics and Gynecology in America. And my guest this morning, Dr. Clyde Randall, former president of the college, recipient in 1978 of the College Distinguished Service Award, a man who's carried a great many responsibilities for the specialties over his years. Clyde, for the sake of all the people who will be looking at this some time later, tell us where you were born and what in your career led you into obstetrics and gynecology.
Well, I was born in Lyons, Kansas, which is a very small town out in Rice County in the middle of Kansas. Spent most of my childhood in Wichita, Kansas, and my schooling was all in Kansas at Manhattan, or State University College in Manhattan, and KU, where I went to medical school and finished in 1931. I really must confess that I went into obstetrics and gynecology not through inspiration, but because of an opportunity to obtain a residency in gynecology, which I was anxious to find in Buffalo, New York. I had spent all of my life in Kansas, and I thought I wanted to get in the East a bit. I explained this to my residents one time in Buffalo, and they smiled and said, "Well, you never made it East, but at least you got to Buffalo."
The time then that you spent in Buffalo ran on for a long number of years, didn't it?
Yes, I went to Buffalo first as a resident in 1932 and was there until 1975. And I was on the faculty at the university from 37 to 75.
Tell me a little bit about your academic progression at Buffalo, since I remember you only as a chairman there.
Well, when I went to Buffalo, the University of Buffalo was a so-called private institution, not supported by public funds. The clinical staff in the School of Medicine were all on a voluntary basis. They were beginning to have some full-time people in the basic sciences, but the clinicians were all on a volunteer basis. I started by being named head of the department in the Buffalo General Hospital. It had always been a department of gynecology and a department of obstetrics, and by 1936 it was becoming, there was greater interest in combined departments, and so I became head of the combined department of obstetrics and gynecology, and continued on a volunteer basis and until in 1962 the State University of New York took over the University of Buffalo. We became a state institution, and I had my choice of going full-time as a department chairman or joining a search committee to find someone who would do this job full-time, and I did elect to continue on a full-time basis, so that made quite a bit of difference in my activities and certainly decreased my participation in clinical practice.
It's sort of hard to imagine on a nice sunny May morning in the year 1985 that a system of graduate medical education that perhaps we think has existed forever is really relatively new, and particularly this morning, Clyde, among the many things that you've contributed to the specialty certainly is your contribution in the development of the Residency Review Committee, and could you tell me a little bit about how that started and when it was?
Well, graduate medical education really didn't exist. It was not even designated as such until the 1930s. The American Board of Obstetrics and Gynecology was organized in 1930 as the third such board to examine candidates for specialization rating in obstetrics and gynecology. And at that time, a number of the professors in medical schools were trying to combine the departments of obstetrics and gynecology, combine obstetrics and gynecology into a single department. And the first time that the board made any recognition of graduate education in obstetrics and gynecology was when they listed in 1936 hospitals in the country. I think there were 87 that they considered to provide an adequate opportunity to study obstetrics and gynecology. Most of those institutions were approved for a single year of residency. And it soon became evident that since the board was requiring 3 years, that individuals were going from hospital to hospital and picking up a year here and a year there in order to acquire 3 years of training. And this was really not progressive training. And that was about the time of the birth of the concept of real graduate education, where there was an educational component to a residence experience. And they began to encourage hospitals to develop 3-year programs that involved education. It was also interesting during that period that there was a great deal of controversy before the boards were organized as to who should accredit graduate training in the specialties. And the AMA, for instance, was assuming the attitude at that time that anything that was developed must have AMA approval. And they tended to favor graduate education becoming an activity of the schools of medicine. And there was quite a period of time in which the status of specialization was in a matter of controversy as to who was going to decide who was qualified to be a specialist and what this individual must do to become a specialist.
Well, then wasn't there also a list of hospitals that the American College of Surgeons put out that was approved?
Yes, our relationships with the surgeons have been long and interesting. We must admit that the very first group of physicians to establish criteria for anyone who was to become a specialist in their field were the surgeons. And they organized the College of Surgeons in 1913 with requirements for admission to the college, which became really the first stated requirements. If you wanted to be a specialist, this is what you had to do. The College of Surgeons continued to take a leading role in the development of training for surgery and were a major influence in the development of graduate education for other specialties. For years, the College of Surgeons regarded obstetrics and gynecology as really a specialty of surgery. You were a gynecologic surgeon, and therefore you should comply with the concepts of the American College of Surgeons. And for years, the College of Surgeons published a list of approved residencies in gynecologic surgery. So to considerable extent there was competition or conflict between the developing boards that were determining specialization and the special societies like the College of Surgeons, which were requiring certain accomplishments before you became eligible for a fellowship in the college.
So really, this is the circumstance up to World War II, or probably around that time there was competition.
Yes, there was another important influence. The year 1915 was a year of great change in organization in American medicine. Not only had the College of Surgeons been formed in 1913, but the College of Physicians was developing, and the licensure in all of the states in the country was in the hands of state boards of medical examiners. And there was a question as to whether state boards of medical examiners should also examine physicians in regard to specialization. The state boards had organized a federation of state boards, and they had regular meetings. The Council on Medical Education in the AMA was smart enough to invite the Federation of State Medical Boards to combined meetings. Some individuals looked on this as a move on the part of the AMA to control licensure as far as the certification of specialists were concerned, and this led to the formation of the National Board of Medical Examiners, which was the first effort by physicians in the United States to have a body that issued a licensure to practice that was nationwide and not statewide. And the Board of Medical Examiners became very much involved in the controversy as to who should examine specialists and certify specialists. So you had the National Board of Medical Examiners and the Federation of State Medical Boards and the medical schools, the AAMC, as well as a relatively few boards. Then the first board was in 1917, the ophthalmologists, and then the otolaryngologists in 1924, and the obstetricians and gynecologists in 1930. So that it was a rather slow development of specialization as far as certifying specialists are concerned.
Well, once World War II was over, and there, I guess, was an almost exponential growth in specialization, how did all these various forces come together to the sort of a system of residency accreditation that we see today?
It's interesting that, again, the College of Surgeons were the first group to organize a residency review committee with other interested organizations, and they developed the first what they call tripartite review committee with the Council on Medical Education of the AMA and the American Board of Surgery. And this was the first so-called tripartite body that considered and evaluated residency training in a specialty.
Of course, in the surgical specialties, that pattern persists right up to the present time.
That's right.
What happened then in OBGYN? How did we eventually get away from the American College of Surgeons?
Well,
get away is the right word.
No, we didn't get away. We stayed away. But it was the College of Surgeons was after 1950 when they organized their first tripartite committee with the AMA and the Board of Surgery. The various surgical specialties, otolaryngology, ophthalmology, all of the so-called surgical specialties quickly formed similar groups. Obstetrics and gynecology was held, were holding out because they refused to be considered a surgical specialty. And as a result, the residencies in obstetrics and gynecology continued to be evaluated and approved or not approved by a joint committee of the American Medical Association, the Council on Medical Education in Hospitals, and the board. And that arrangement continued until 1957. And at that time, the board, for reasons that are complicated and I don't think we want to get into, and I don't think I ever understood clearly, they decided to have a tripartite committee with the College of Surgeons, the Council on Medical Education, the AMA, and the American Board of Obstetrics and Gynecology.
So we'd really date then our Residency Review Committee to 1957.
1957. But prior to that time, it was quite an informal affair, a committee of the AMA and of the board approving residencies, and the AMA publishing annually a list of approved residencies.
We don't have the College of Surgeons now. What happened as time passed?
It was evident from the beginning that it was of the so-called Residency Review Committee for Obstetrics and Gynecology that the involvement of the American College of Surgeons with the Council on Medical Education and the board was not an acceptable idea to many obstetricians and gynecologists who did not consider it appropriate for the College of Surgeons to be involved in the assessment and approval of residencies in obstetrics and gynecology. This feeling was particularly evident due to the fact that the first National Organization of Obstetricians and Gynecologists had been formed a few years earlier in 1950. The American Academy of Obstetrics and Gynecology was organized, and in 1956, when the officers of the in 1956, the Academy voted to change their name to the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists. And about that same time, they learned that the American Board of Obstetrics and Gynecology was considering forming a tripartite committee to review residency programs with the College of Surgeons and the Council on Medical Education, the AMA.
You can imagine the political maneuvering starting then.
Yes. There were a great many individuals active in the college who were very distressed at the fact that the board would begin working with the College of Surgeons instead of the College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists. The situation was more complicated because of the fact that individuals don't maintain all of their activity in one organization. And some of the officers of the college were also officers of the board. And the college found it particularly difficult to appreciate why these individuals were not embracing the college as a participant in the Residency Review Committee. If I had to explain why, I think it is largely because of the fact that in its early years, the college did not require certification as an obstetrician and gynecologist for fellowship in the college. When the college was first formed, the first controversy was whether all of the physicians listed in the directory of American medicine issued by the AMA, who indicated that they were specialists in obstetrics and gynecology, should be admitted to the college. One of the considerations involved was the fact that many of these individuals who listed themselves as specialists in obstetrics and gynecology also listed themselves as specialists in 2 or 3 other things. And so the college set up a credentials committee to look at the credentials and get some information on what individuals were doing, and kept their fellowship restricted to individuals who really were specializing in obstetrics and gynecology. But because they didn't at the same time say you're a specialist in obstetrics and gynecology if you've been certified, the board tended to hold out on the participation of the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists in the Residency Review Committee. And actually, the board had set up its requirements and had maintained the same requirements for 25 years prior to this, so that it was not an unexpected criteria that they were insisting upon.
What made the change then? What
Well, as far
got the surgeons and in the obstetricians?
by that time I was on the board, and I am convinced in my own mind that the thing that made the difference was in 1963, the college voted overwhelmingly to require certification for fellowship. And it's interesting that within 6 months, the board had decided that the present operation of the Residency Review Committee was not satisfactory. And interestingly enough, they didn't immediately try to substitute the American College of OBGYN for the American College of Surgeons. They said, we will go back to the arrangement where we have a bipartite committee, and the representatives of the Council on Medical Education, the AMA, and the board will again rule on the acceptability of residency programs in obstetrics and gynecology. So for another 5 years, the residencies were reviewed by representatives of the AMA and the board. It is interesting, however, that the original tripartite committee with the College of Surgeons consisted of 12 representatives. These 12 individuals were all fellows of the college. They were 4 of them diplomats on the board, and a number of them were also in the College of Surgeons. So the same 12 people divided themselves up between the AMA and the Council on Medical Education. And for 5 years, they served as a residency review committee with 2 sponsoring organizations. Finally, in 1967, the American board petitioned the AMA to form a new tripartite committee with the American College of OBGYN and the board and the Council on Medical Education. And everyone agreed to it very quickly, and it has operated very satisfactorily ever since.
So that was 1967.
That was 1967. And the first committee had been set up in 1957, and they spent 10 years maneuvering around before they developed the arrangement that was pretty obviously logical from the very beginning.
Clyde, how long did you serve on the Residency Review Committee?
Well, to my surprise, I was listed as a representative of the Council on Medical Education, the AMA, when the review committee was first formed in 1957. When I became a member of the board in 1960, the AMA says, this is a conflict of interest, you have to get off. But the board put me back on, so that really in all practical purposes from 57 until, as you know, when I became secretary of the board in 1964, I became an ex officio member of the Residency Review Committee. So that in all, from a practical standpoint, I served on the committee from 57 until 76.
That has to be the longest tenure, surely, that anybody had.
Well, I don't know, but it gave me a familiarity with the development of the board that has always been interesting.
you have perhaps a few words in conclusion about what you see having happened to the structure and function of the Residency Review Committee over those now almost 30 years?
Well, the interesting feature of the activities of the Residency Review Committee, as I have seen them, is the fact that the board had always considered the requirements to become a specialist in obstetrics and gynecology a responsibility of the board. And it was after the Residency Review Committee had been operating a number of years that the board began to realize that it would be sensible to split off some of their responsibilities, and the Residency Review Committee really became responsible for the guidelines that tell a director of a residency program how to direct his program. Now, I think the Residency Review Committee would have also been responsible for the content, educational content of a residence experience, except for the development of CREOG in 1965 and 66. And when this Council for Resident Education in Obstetrics and Gynecology was formed, then it became evident that the Council was going to really be responsible for the educational content of residency programs. The Residency Review Committee was going to see that that content was made available to the residents in the program. And the board was going to examine the finished product to see if he had picked up what they thought he should know.
Even though things seem more complicated, actually they've become more logical.
Well, they've become more logical, they've become clearer, and I think everyone is doing a better job because they don't try to do everything.
Clyde, we certainly are going to ask you back another day to tell us about the American Board. I think it's remarkable that you surely have had the longest experience with the Residency Review Committee of any of us about, and the same would certainly apply to the Secretariat of the Board, but you told us about one today.
Well, I've always had a peculiar feeling about the board because the year I was a senior medical student was the year in which the board was founded. And the bulletin board outside the chairman of Obstetrics and Gynecology office had an announcement of the formation of the American Board of Obstetrics and Gynecology. And I read this thing with a couple of classmates who recall that I said at that moment that if they're going to start giving examinations to us after we finish school, that's the end. I wasn't interested in that type of activity.
Our guest today, Dr. Clyde Randall, past president of the college, senior statesman, and a person who clearly knows more about what's happened in the accreditation of graduate medical education than anyone else we might have invited in. Clyde, thank you for being with us.
Well, Warren, it's a pleasure. As you know, I like to talk about the board and the review committee.